I'm delighted to say that Charlie Lovett is going to start us off. He's a New York Times best-selling novelist and playwright, known to many of you here, I know. And his plays for children have been seen in over 5,000 productions worldwide. He hosts the podcast Inside the Writer's Studio and is a collector of Lewis Carroll materials, including Carroll's 1888 typewriter, and has written many works on Carroll, one of which at least he's going to talk about today.
Thank you. Everybody hear me all right? Good. I've been asked to make a couple of announcements. First, there are some free giveaway items over at the far end of the room that you might want to check out, not while I'm talking to you. Also, as Carrollians, we celebrate holidays slightly differently from other people. I mean, there are some people who celebrate the 4th of July as the original Brexit Day, whereas we celebrate it as Alice in Wonderland Day. There are some people tonight in England who will be setting their bonfires because they celebrate this as bonfire night. We, of course, celebrate it as Through the Looking Glass weekend. So enjoy your whatever way you celebrate Through the Looking Glass weekend, whether it's trying to climb through your bathroom mirror or whatever, enjoy that. I'd like to thank you all for being here, both online and in person, and in the future, those of you who may be watching this as a recording. And especially glad to see some students here and some younger people, because I think what I have to say is especially relevant to the next generation of scholars who so many of whom we heard from this morning. So I'd like to talk today about 3 related topics. I think better understanding these subjects will serve the future of Lewis Carroll scholarship, and for that matter, scholarship about any historical figure. These topics are, let's see if this is going to work. Nope. Okay, hang on. There we go. These contexts are context, research, and vision. As you know, I've recently published a new biography, Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, in which I examine the role Charles Lutwidge Dodgson's religious upbringing, education, formation, and beliefs played in shaping his life and works. I'd long thought that Dodgson's religion was absolutely central to everything he did. And I honestly believe that if you asked him to name the most important aspect of his life, he would not have answered children's books or mathematics or photography or logic, but simply my faith. Yet this central aspect of the man, which underpinned all the more famous sides of his multifaceted polymath, has been much neglected by his biographers, never getting more than a chapter or so in even the longest studies, and often being reduced to a few sentences. Over a decade ago, I set out to address that problem. And in the process of working on my book, I had a lot of time to consider context, research, and vision, topics which I think are key to the biographer's task. Each is sometimes overlooked or taken for granted, something we do at our peril, and what's worse, the peril of our subject. I'll be using examples from Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, as well as a few that didn't make it into the final draft of the book, to explore these subjects. I thought this might be a bit more interesting than simply rehashing a book I trust you will all want to purchase and read for yourselves. And it is a book, if nothing else, that cannot be summed up in a 45-minute talk. Let's begin with context, possibly the most important of the 3. Some of the biggest misconceptions we have about Lewis Carroll and other historical figures come from a lack of understanding of context, the world in which they lived and worked, the broader issues that shaped that world, the details of their daily lives, the books they read, the art they loved, and on and on and on. Understanding context means first moving beyond the obvious primary source materials, and second, avoiding the trap of judging, in this case, a Victorian man, by the standards of the 21st century. Mark Richards, shown here emerging from a rabbit hole with an empty marmalade jar, is famous in our household, at least, for noting that authors who write of the privations of life at Christ Church in the 19th century and how miserable those privations must have made Dodgson and his contemporaries are not considering facts such as cold water, drafty rooms, and so on in their historical context. Here we see the great quadrangle of Christ Church as it was at the time that he arrived. I think that figure there in the corner is Selwyn Goodacre. I'm not absolutely certain, but so yes, by the standards of our standards of life, 19th century college might have seemed uncomfortable. But to Dodgson, what we see as privations were merely the ordinary facts of daily life. A more modern example might make the point better. A teenager today would consider life without a cell phone or the internet or video games to be a great misery. But I was a teenager in the 1970s and couldn't even conceive of a cell phone or the internet or video games, and I was perfectly happy. Likewise, when we say that the privations of 19th century Christchurch made Charles Dodgson miserable, what we really mean is they would make us miserable. Let's look at a couple of examples of how lack of even the most basic context can lead to misinterpretation and misunderstanding. First, consider Lewis Carroll's most famous photograph, the well-known and oft reproduced image of Alice as a beggar maid. How often have we seen this used by 20th and 21st century commentators to argue that Dodgson has sexual feelings about girls, or that he was in some way sexualizing Alice Little? Before we even begin to refute this with obvious evidence from Dodgson's diaries and letters, the recollections of those whom he loved as children, and an examination of the Victorian cult of the child, we need to understand the artistic context of the photograph itself. It's quite clear from the details of the vegetation that this photograph was taken on the same spot around the same time, quite likely on the same day, as another photo of Alice in her finest dress. Here, even with the primary source material, we begin to see a broader context. The beggar child photograph is not a one-off, it is one of a pair, intended to show the contrast between two children, identical except for their dress. One child comes from poverty, the other from wealth. The photographs can even be looked at as a theological commentary. Children are all equal in the eyes of God, regardless of their outer trappings. Nor was the idea of such a pairing something invented by Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. Images such as William Hogarth's Industry and Idleness did the exact same thing in the 18th century. And Dodgson's photographic contemporary Oscar Relander followed suit in images like The Two Ways of Life, and in a pair of photographs exhibited at the Getty Museum in 2019 of two women portrayed by the same model in a kitchen, one a serving girl, the other the lady of the house. Pulling back our focus just a little, giving ourselves even a sliver of context allows us to view the beggar maid photo in a much more authentic light. From Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, I offer another example, the prayers in Charles Lutwidge Dodgson's diary. Some writers have considered the confessional portion of these prayers as indicative that Dodgson was harboring overwhelming guilt as the result of some major sin. How else could he call himself vile and worthless and wish to break the trammels of evil habits? But the diary prayers should not be considered outside the context of Dodgson's religious upbringing, of the services of the Church of England, and of the habits of other Victorians in recording prayers in their own diaries. From his earliest days, Dodgson was taught, in the words of the family devotional cards, that all mankind are sinners and therefore cannot save themselves. This lesson was repeated over and over throughout his education and right through to his preparation for ordination into the diaconate. During term time at Christ Church, Dodgson attended the service of morning prayer most days, and even while on vacation, he often read family prayers with his sisters and always attended Sunday services unless prevented by illness. Central to all these services is the general confession, in which Dodgson, on a near daily basis, confessed to having erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep, and calls himself a miserable offender. In the Anglican worldview, man is by nature sinful and will commit sins even in the brief interval between one day's morning and evening prayer. These sins must be acknowledged and confessed, and a resolution made for amendment of life. The priest declares forgiveness of the penitent and the absolution. Then a few hours later, it all happens again. Dodgson's diary prayers often borrow language from both the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. And even that phrase, vile and worthless as I am, comes from a book of services for the canonical hours for Anglicans, called the Hours of the Passion. When one looks at the diaries of figures ranging from Dodgson's friend, Reverend Henry Perry Liddon, to the future Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Archibald Campbell Tate, similar entries occur. Liddon, by then a towering figure in the English church, called himself in the 1860s a poor sinner and most unworthy. Like Dodgson, the diary prayers of his Rugby headmaster, Archibald Campbell Tate, were filled with confession and pleas for forgiveness. "O Lord, receive this morning my humble confession of deep sin," he wrote in 1849. In 1847, he, like Dodgson, 15 years later, quoted 1 Corinthians 9:27, "How can I preach to others if I be myself a castaway?" Prayers in Charles Lutwidge Dodgson's diary, which seem on first examination to reveal some monumental sin, are understood once examined in a broader context to be perfectly normal for a Victorian Anglican clergyman, and very much in keeping with the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer, from which all Anglicans pray and worship. This all brings up another point Mark Richards made to me recently. He claimed that because I not only had a background in Anglicanism, having grown up in the Episcopal Church and worshiped most of my adult life in the Anglican tradition, but also because I believed in Anglican doctrine, this made me especially suited to understand the context of Dodgson's religious life. I certainly agree that having a lifetime of experience in Anglican worship allowed me to see patterns, allusions, theological stances, and so on in Dodgson's diaries, letters, and other writings that might otherwise have escaped me. Does the fact that I actually believe much of what Dodgson believed give me an even greater insight into this context? I'm not sure I have an answer to that question, but I do think to be a scholar of Dodgson's religion, which really means to be a scholar of Dodgson, one must be able to at least have sympathy for one who holds such beliefs. And I think it's fair to say that sympathy is not always present in scholarship. In the pages of Lewis Carroll Formed by Faith, I examine the broader context of Dodgson's religious upbringing, the tension in the church between the high church and evangelical wings, and other issues that lend a greater depth of field to the understanding of Dodgson's life. There is no part of this study, from his preaching to his writings for children, his prayer life and his gifts to charity, his attitude towards Sunday rest and eternal punishment, that does not benefit from stepping back and considering it in a broader context. It is true that this often means a context that includes the politics of the Victorian English Church. And while that may seem daunting, I had no wish to write an unreadable book, or even a book that was only comprehensible to those already versed in Victorian Anglicanism. As Mark Goodacre writes in his introduction to Lewis Carroll Formed by Faith, and here I will allow him to blow my horn, at each point, Lovett patiently explains terminology, backgrounds, and contexts, and brings alive a religious and academic culture that goes from being foreign to familiar. The entire book itself is, in a very real sense, an argument for the doctrine of context. I'm asking my readers to consider what they know about Lewis Carroll from other biographies in the context of his religious upbringings and beliefs, and trusting that when they do so, new insights and understanding will come into focus. To give a specific example of how our conception of one famous moment in Dodgson's life can be altered by considering its context, let's look at the river trip of July 4th, 1862, when he told the story of Alice's adventures underground to Alice Little and her two sisters while rowing up the Thames. You're probably picturing a lazy summer day in a string of lazy summer days filled with storytelling and river trips. After all, Dodgson himself wrote, "Many a day had we rowed together on that quiet stream." But if we pull back the focus and view that famous day in a slightly wider context, we may have a different vision. Friday, July 4th fell in the midst of a hectic week. Dodgson had had a friend staying with him since June 27th and had been a busy host. On July 5th, the two men would depart for a few days in London, where Dodgson would visit the international exhibition that was drawing tens of thousands of people a day. That Sunday before the river trip began Commemoration Week at Oxford, with its various festivities and ceremonies. Dodgson had attended commemoration on Wednesday with 3,000 to 4,000 others. You can see him there, he's the one on the left. Being on the river with just his friend Robinson Duckworth and the three little sisters must have been a serene interlude. Step back a little further, and we must consider that Dodgson had, less than a month before this river trip, preached his first sermon. Then on the Sunday before the trip, Dodgson attended a packed University Church of St. Mary's for the morning service and to hear E.B. Pusey, his sponsor at Christ Church and an old friend of his father, preach. Given that Dodgson was about to have what has since been called an inspiration of genius, Pusey's words seem especially relevant. There is nothing human in which man is so born out of himself, which is so little dependent on himself, in which he can give so little account of himself, as the conceptions, inventions, combinations, and discoveries of genius. The mind moves not by an act of its own will. Even lesser degrees of ordinary men are conscious that it comes to them, as they would say. It is not of their own power or will, but it is given to them. Pusey's words are remarkably similar to those used by Dodgson in later years to explain his writing of the Alice stories. In his article, Alice on Stage, he recalled, "I added many fresh ideas which seemed to grow of themselves upon the original stock. But every such idea, and nearly every word of the dialogue came of itself. Alice and the Looking Glass are made up almost wholly of bits and scraps, single ideas which came of themselves. What are we to make of all this? The river trip reconceived as a brief hiatus and a week of big crowds at major events. The recently ordained storyteller had just begun his preaching life. Pusey's sermon on divine inspiration, whose words seemed to cling to Dodgson years later. Context is not always about drawing specific conclusions. And in this case, I leave those to you. But context can always give us a richer, fuller view of events, which in the past, we may have seen through a narrower lens than we realized. One of the ways we establish and understand context is through research. When we set out to research the life of Lewis Carroll, we most frequently consider his published writings, though far too often we limit ourselves to the most famous of those writings and neglect a massive output beyond the Alice books and the Snark. His diaries, by which we must mean the unexpurgated version and not the 1954 two-volume abridgment, and his letters. Certainly, this is a good place to start. And no serious Lewis Carroll scholar can even begin to do their work without access to the full 10-volume edition of the diaries, the complete published works, including the 6 volumes of the pamphlets, the 4 so far volumes of published letters, and a copy of Collingwood's biography. But the obvious primary source materials can only tell us so much, and what they often lack is the aforementioned context. The digital world has made consulting a wider range of sources not only easier, but essential for the scholar. Millions of pages of newspapers have been digitized. A vast array of obscure books can be consulted with the click of a mouse. Census records, parish documents, manuscript archives, and much more are available to us in ways they never were before. The days when a serious scholar needed a grant or a fellowship to visit faraway archives and a research assistant to sift through endless volumes of old newspapers are gone, and private funding is no longer essential for groundbreaking research. I myself remember spending long days in the 1990s at the British Library Newspaper Archive in Colindale, paging through volumes of the St. James's Gazette and other papers. Now they're all available on my computer for a small annual fee. All that being said, it is important to remember that a lot of information is not on the internet. Just because we can't call up a document on our computer screen or by emailing a librarian for a scan doesn't mean that document isn't hiding out there somewhere. Of course, I consulted all the standard primary source materials on Charles Dodgson at great length and in great depth when setting out on this project. But many of the new insights and discoveries of this book came from other sources, both published and unpublished, largely untapped by previous biographers. The sermons and other writings and speeches of his father, his schoolmasters, and his bishop, the books that shaped his religious life at Rugby, church records from Daresbury and Croft, his ordination file in the Oxford Diocesan Archives, secondary research on the churches where he preached, sermons he heard at key moments in his life, books from his personal theological library, press accounts of everything from Queen Victoria's visit to Rugby to Prince Albert's funeral, and much more. There's several keys to moving beyond the obvious materials and consulting items which may be of great value to a particular field of study and of great value in establishing the context of that field. One is imaginative thinking. What might be interesting? What might shed light? And an especially important question, what has been overlooked for whatever reason by previous scholars? Many materials are easy to find if it only occurs to you to go looking for them. I discovered the name of the priest whose sermons Dodgson heard on Sunday mornings while he was a schoolboy at Richmond, and then found quite easily published volumes of those sermons. But I had to think to go looking for them. The same is true of the Pusey sermon on divine inspiration, which I quoted earlier. It was easy to find. What required effort was the imaginative leap that led to looking for it. My second piece of advice for researchers is not to discriminate. Cast your nets wide, you fishers of biographical details, for you never know where that tantalizing tidbit might come from. Materials as outwardly dull as parish records of deaths, marriages, and baptisms contain fascinating revelations about the work of Lewis Carroll's father, also named Charles Dodgson. For instance, the parish registers show that though his pay as rector of Croft, where he moved in 1843, was much higher than that as perpetual curate of Daresbury, his first appointment, Charles Dodgson's parish duties at Daresbury were much more daunting. At Daresbury, the average total of baptisms, weddings, and burials each year was 119. In Croft, it was only 28. As Charles Dodgson took on more diocesan duties in the Diocese of Ripon, he hired curates to take care of his parish duties at Croft, until he himself was performing only about 12% of these essential ceremonies. Parish registers look uninteresting, but carefully examined, they can reveal so much about the lives they document. I spent hundreds of hours searching digitized newspaper archives for relevant materials. I found a lot of useless articles, but I also found some gems. Research is like panning for gold. It might take a lot of pans of gravel to find that one nugget. When Lewis Carroll's father became a canon of Ripon Cathedral with an additional salary and the requirement that he spend 3 months a year at Ripon, one of his parishioners was so angry at Reverend Dodgson's perceived neglect of his parish in Croft that he wrote a letter to the editor which concluded, "The only good part of the story is that Reverend C.D. is so highly beloved by the greater part of his parishioners that if agreeable to himself, they would not object to change his 3 months' absence into a permanent one." From a musty old newspaper comes a new insight into life in Dodgson's parish. Another key to research is persistence. Often the items that will shed new light are not easy to find. If they were, someone would have looked at them already. Keep looking, keep contacting librarians and archivists. I had assistance not just from librarians at places like the Bodleian and the British Library, but from the Rugby School Archives, the Worcester Public Library, the Oxford Diocesan Archives, and more. There's hardly a library in the world that doesn't have something that you won't find anywhere else. And sometimes the item you need or didn't know you needed is not in a library at all. Private collectors, book dealers, and auction houses all still play an important role in scholarship. I ended up purchasing several items from dealers and auction houses during the course of my research. And while that fact may undermine my point about scholarship as a level playing field, it is at least a more level playing field than it once was. Chief among my finds at dealers and auction houses was the single surviving copy of Lewis Carroll's father's pamphlet for preparing young people for confirmation, an incredible blueprint for how he taught his children the tenets of Christianity. A set of manuscript notebooks by James Tate II, Lewis Carroll's schoolmaster and housemaster at Richmond Grammar School, which includes outlines and excerpts from lectures and lessons Tate gave to the students. And a copy of the Rugby School lists that carefully charts young C.L. Dodgson's progress through the school. Here you see him listed at the very bottom of his class due to absence and illness that semester. These all became essential resources, and only by keeping a careful eye on the market, a part of that persistence I mentioned, did I discover their existence. Fourthly, keep following the trail. So often finding the item I thought I was looking for was only the first step. In the Oxford Diocesan Archives, I examined Dodgson's ordination file, but that was hardly the end of the story. That file told me what theological lectures Dodgson had attended, so I researched the lecturers and their subjects. I also searched beyond Dodgson's own file, hoping I might find an ordination examination given by Bishop Samuel Wilberforce. Wilberforce, who ordained Dodgson as a deacon in 1861, famously conducted his ordination examinations viva voce, leaving no paper trail. But sure enough, after searching folder after folder, I discovered a written deacon's examination, probably from a candidate who was unable to travel to the ordination retreat at Cuddeston. That examination gave me an extremely useful information about what Dodgson's oral examination would have been like. Finally, luck can be extremely helpful to the researcher, but I learned something while working on this book. Luck comes to those who use their imagination, who cast a wide net, who practice persistence, and who keep following the trail. I could fill many lectures talking about how I researched Lewis Carroll formed by faith, but for today, a pair of examples will suffice. Nothing had ever been written about Charles Lutwidge Dodgson's confirmation, essentially the coming of age rite in the Anglican Church, when the promises made in his name by the confirmand's godparents at infant baptism were taken on by himself. Dodgson, I discovered after much research, was confirmed at Rugby on the 1st of June, 1847. Two books were especially key in understanding Dodgson's preparation for confirmation. One was Instructions in the Doctrine and Practice of Christianity by then rugby master George Edward Lynch Cotton, who was responsible for preparing the boys for the rite. And the other was a book of sermons preached on the topic of confirmation in the weeks leading up to the service by headmaster Archibald Campbell Tate. I found a copy of Cotton's book fairly easily, but Tate's eluded me. I could find no copy on the secondhand market, nor did WorldCat list a single copy in any of thousands of libraries. Frustrated, I began to think about Tate in a broader context. After rugby, he became Bishop of London and then Archbishop of Canterbury. The official London residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury is Lambeth Palace on the south bank of the Thames. Did they have a library or archive, I wondered? A quick inquiry confirmed that they did, and furthermore, that they had 2 copies of Tate's book of confirmation sermons. They scanned a copy, and a few days later, I was reading. This led to further revelations, and I decided on my next trip to London to pay a visit to Lambeth Palace to see what else might be lurking there. Imagine my delight when I discovered that they had manuscript notebooks of all of Tate's lectures and sermons delivered to rugby boys on religious subjects during Dodgson's years there. It was an amazing resource, even if Tate, like me, had a habit of allowing his handwriting to deteriorate into illegibility by about the 4th or 5th paragraph of each sermon. Nonetheless, I learned more about Dodgson's religious education at rugby than I ever thought possible, all from notebooks which hadn't been examined in over 100 years, and all less than half a mile from the spot where the Lewis Carroll Society of Britain had been founded. Some research triumphs are the result of such outside-the-box thinking, not just about what might be relevant, but about where such materials might be hiding. Others are sheer luck. For anyone working on a book about Charles Lutwidge Dodgson's religious life, surely the holy grail of research successes would be to find a complete copy of a sermon by Dodson. No manuscripts survive in the family collection or elsewhere. I was unable to trace any press accounts of any of his many sermons. His diary contains only an outline of his first sermon, helpful, but cryptic in places. I had just about given up when, looking for something else entirely, I came across a reference to an early 20th century magazine that included an article about Lewis Carroll as a preacher and, allegedly, the text of a sermon he delivered. Skeptical, I went looking for the magazine, which seemed to survive only in the British Library. I sent a note to my contact there, and he called up the bound volume and took photographs of the relevant pages. Days later, I was staring at what claimed to be the full text of a sermon by Dodson, reconstructed by the clergyman for whom he had preached it. It's not the same as a manuscript in Dodgson's own hand, but it was a remarkable find nonetheless, and the sermon is reproduced in its entirety in Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith. I'd like to make one other plea to researchers. Please document your sources. I much prefer a book that is overladen with endnotes to one that leaves me asking, how do we know that? I can't tell you how many times I found in a Lewis Carroll biography something stated as fact with no attribution, no indication how or where the biographer discovered that alleged truth. This often meant I had to spend hours or days digging, trying to follow the path of a previous scholar with no map or compass. As scholars, our job is not to leave our successors wandering in the wood where things have no name, but to lay a clear path so that they can then move forward, building on what we have done. The worst mindset for a scholar is to think you are having the final say. The best is to think you are laying the groundwork for others to build upon. I certainly don't intend Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, to be the last word on Dodgson's religious life. On the contrary, I hope it will be the book that opens the field for others to study in even greater depth. And I hope I've marked my trail well for those future scholars. Context and research are perhaps not that difficult to understand. Any scholar can easily apply the advice I've given on these 2 topics to their work. Vision, on the other hand, can be a little more difficult to get a handle on. Vision is not simply something that can be looked up in a library or an archive. Vision is not necessarily about poring over source materials. It can just as easily mean sitting alone in a quiet room and thinking. But vision is essential if we want to continue to take scholarship in new directions. We cannot simply share the vision of scholars past and rest on their conclusions. Vision requires that we take what we discover and see our subject anew. But vision's not setting about to prove a thesis. Having your own preconceived notions is as limiting as resting on those of previous scholars. And as biographers, we must understand that a life does not set out to prove a thesis. Part of vision is setting out to discover what you can and drawing conclusions from all that you discover, not just the parts that contribute to your preconceived notions. Vision is about seeing beyond previous assumptions, including your own, and it begins by not taking anything for granted. If an assumption or an accepted piece of common knowledge about your subject is not clearly supported by the primary source materials, it shouldn't be allowed to cloud your vision. But we constantly make assumptions not only about our subjects, but also about the materials we might consult. Any bookseller, book collector, probably even any religion professor will happily tell you there is nothing more boring than an old volume of Victorian sermons. It's such a cliche that I've actually heard people say, such and such is as dull as an old book of sermons. Vision requires that we place ourselves in a world where such books were not considered the epitome of boredom, a world where such books were written, published, read, and reread, and where people wrote letters to the editor about them and argued about them around the dinner table. Vision requires understanding that what might seem insignificant to us today held great significance in its time and must be understood to give us a clear picture of that time. I chose this particular example because I read scores of Victorian sermons while working on Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, mostly from volumes that hadn't been opened in a century or more. Sermons by Archdeacon Charles Dodson, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, E.B. Pusey, Scott Surtees, James Woodford, Archibald Campbell Tate, and many others, all contributed to my understanding of Lewis Carroll's faith journey. As a scholar, it's my job to have the vision to see the value in this material. As a researcher, it's my job to read it all. And as a writer, it's my job to make what to a modern reader could seem like the driest thing I know, not only interesting, but revelatory. Vision also means looking at your subject from a different angle, especially if your subject died over 120 years ago and has been subjected to scholarly scrutiny more or less ever since. If you set out to write a book about how Lewis Carroll told a story to some girls while rowing up the river and then got that story published, you aren't exactly breaking new ground. Yet sometimes in our quest for a new angle, we overreach. If you set out to write a book about how Lewis Carroll was a space alien from the planet Meldork, whose story was a coded history of the universe, you have overreached. How then do we focus our vision on a new angle without going off the deep end? How do we balance vision with the historical record? When you're developing a new vision, when you are alone in that quiet room thinking, it's important not to censor yourself. But before you take that vision and spend a decade turning it into a book, it's good to run it through 3 filters: novelty, relevance, and truth. My vision was of a man who had been trained as a Christian all his life, for whom the tenets of the Christian faith, and especially the idea that God was a perfectly loving God, lay at the center of his being and undergirded all that he did. This was not a hypothesis I was trying to prove, because I had come to this conclusion after years of studying Dodson. But did that vision pass the tests of novelty, relevance, and truth? The first question was easy to answer. I had read all the major biographies of Dodson and countless articles in Carrollian and more general publications. Most mentioned that Dodson was a deacon in the Church of England, usually without explaining what that meant. Some discussed his decision not to proceed to the priesthood or mentioned his sermons or prayers, but none had explored this aspect of Dodson in any real depth. I felt confident that my vision passed the test of novelty. If I'd been planning to write a book on the fact that Lewis Carroll had wavy hair, I think it would be fair to question that project on the test of relevance. But seeing Charles Dodson as a man of faith, it might not be as sexy or controversial as the claims of some scholars, but I didn't see any way it could be considered irrelevant. In fact, as I delved deeper into the research, it seemed more and more relevant. That left the test of truth. Was Lewis Carroll a man of faith? The historical record proved this again and again, both in primary and secondary sources. My vision was relevant and true, and perhaps most strikingly novel, at least in the depth of study that I had in mind. And in this, future scholars of Lewis Carroll should take great hope. Even after more than a century of study, I found an aspect of Dodson, an angle, a vision that allowed me to go where other scholars had not gone before. And if I can do it, So can you. Don't assume previous biographers, even those whom you admire as scholars, found out everything. My particular vision led me to sources essential to telling my story, but which had never been used by any previous biographer. When you look at your subject from a different angle, when you have a different vision, you see different things, you find different things. Many of the names you've heard me mention today, names of people who helped form Lewis Carroll's faith, will not surprise you if you are familiar with his biography. My book includes deep dives into the work and teachings of Carroll's father, of his schoolmasters, James Tate II and Archibald Campbell Tate, of his sponsor at Christ Church, Edward Bouverie Pusey, and of his bishop, Samuel Wilberforce. But other names are less familiar, perhaps. And in Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith, I will introduce you to George Heron, who baptized Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, Charles Mayer, his former master who died unexpectedly at Rugby, Charles Abel Hertley and William Jacobson, whose divinity lectures prepared Dodgson for ordination, and many others. Before I conclude, I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of those characters, a man who has not, to my knowledge, appeared in any previous Lewis Carroll biography, but who occupies significant space in this one, as I believe he was particularly important in Carroll's Christian formation. The Reverend George Edward Lynch Cotton. Cotton was an evangelical who had come to Rugby School as a master in 1837, in the days of Dr. Thomas Arnold, and he was a constant in Lewis Carroll's 4 years at the public school. Each boy at Rugby had, in addition to a form master and instructors in various subjects, a tutor who remained with that student throughout his years. Form masters changed from year to year, but for 4 years, Cotton was Charles Dodgson's tutor. More importantly, Cotton was in charge of much of the religious instruction for the Rugby boys, and in particular, in preparing them for confirmation. It was Cotton who awarded Dodgson the Divinity Prize, leading Headmaster Tate to write, "His examination for the Divinity Prize was one of the most credible exhibitions I have ever seen." Cotton also awarded Dodgson multiple mathematics prizes and served as his form master for the 5th form. Headmaster Tate praised Cotton for much aid received from him, especially by his ministrations in the school chapel. In defending Rugby against a charge of lax religious teaching in 1849, Tate wrote, "If you really wish to know whether the charge you have made against the school is unfounded, I beg to refer you to such books as I have distinctly recommended in the school, e.g., to Mr. Cotton's admirable book of prayers and other helps to devotion, or to his short work on confirmation." Dodgson owned copies of both of these books and kept them for the rest of his life. In a scrapbook he kept as an adult, Dodgson pasted a picture of Cotton clipped from his obituary. Cotton's books are essential reading for anyone wanting to understand how the Christian religion was taught at Rugby. But the most remarkable thing I discovered about Cotton, and perhaps this is why Lewis Carroll kept his books for the rest of his life and clipped his picture from the newspaper, was what his biographer Arthur Penrhyn Stanley wrote about him. Imagine, as I read this description, that the author is describing not a school teacher from Rugby in the 1840s, but the adult Lewis Carroll. His keen and boyish sense of life's mirthful side never left him. He was often the most amusing and laughter-moving of companions. There was a natural and quiet flow of genial humor that overran and freshened like a mountain spring the dry places and arid relations, the numbing cares and anxieties of scholastic life. But with all this, he was never frivolous or self-indulgent. The vein of ceaseless humor which played beneath an exterior somewhat grim and saturnine was combined with an intensity and earnestness of religious life which formed the chief feature in his character. A remarkable description that certainly could have been taken from a biography of Lewis Carroll himself. There is much more to say about Cotton, and that, of course, is why one writes books, so that one can say more than can be compressed into a single lecture. But I cite this example of an important influence in the life of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, completely overlooked by his previous biographers, and as an example of the sort of discoveries that await the scholar who approaches their work with a full appreciation of context, research, and vision. I alluded to the death of Rugby master Charles Mayer a moment ago, and I'd like to end by looking at the death during term time of another Rugby master, George John Kennedy. The death of a master in a boarding school community, as I well know, comes as a shock to everyone. The boys who gathered in the chapel the day after Kennedy's death must have been a somber group as they watched Headmaster Tate ascend the pulpit to deliver his weekly sermon, a solemn lesson on death. After only 3 sentences, Tate spoke words that are stunning in the direct link they provide between Charles Dodgson's teenage faith and his later work. "What is life?" said Tate. "Is it all a dream?" In his congregation sat a 15-year-old boy who would grow up to write the 2 most famous dream narratives in English literature. His 2-part novel, Sylvie and Bruno, while not strictly a dream narrative, would explore states of being similar to dreaming and their relationship to waking life, and would begin its dedicatory poem with the line, "Is all our life then but a dream?" In his 1876 Easter greeting, he would compare the passage from earthly life to life everlasting, to waking from a dream. In fact, this idea of life as a dream state from which we wake to eternal life would occur more than once in his writings, most famously in the epilogue verse to Through the Looking Glass, which ends with the haunting line, which drives home this connection between earthly life and dreaming, and by implication, resurrected life and waking, at the same time echoing the words of Archibald Campbell Tate, "Life, what is it but a dream?" When I read those words in Tate's sermon, "What is life? Is it all a dream?" I knew that I had a story to tell, and with context, research, and vision, I have done my best to tell it. Now, I promised some show and tell to this group. We're now finished with the formal part of the lecture. And you saw some pictures of books on the PowerPoint, all of which I have here, and you're welcome to come and look at the break. But I wanted to just give an example as from sort of a collector's angle of the journey that you might take that allows you to use these ideas of context, of research and vision, all in adding an item to your collection that connects to the book that you just wrote. So, well, first, sorry, I forgot what order these slides are in. First, it is incumbent upon me.
You want to just show you now?
Well, no, I still have some slides to show, yeah. It's incumbent upon me as a recently published writer to tell you that you can buy copies of any of my books, either online at home or here in the room. I have 3 books that were published in the last month and a half. That's, thank you, COVID. That's why that all happened, including my first foray into the world of what we now call middle grade literature, which is a category which Alice in Wonderland probably would have been placed originally if we had that. So, but I do have copies of Formed by Faith here in the room if anyone's interested. Now, for show and tell. I believe the Lewis Carroll, I think Linda was originally contacted by a gentleman at a library in London called the Evangelical Library. And he said, "We have this Bible that belonged to Lewis Carroll. Can you tell us anything about it? We don't really want it." And so I started to correspond with this gentleman, and he sent me some photographs. And the first thing I said was, well, this Bible did not belong to Lewis Carroll, because that signature that you see up in the corner that says C. Dodgson, if you know Lewis Carroll's handwriting, you'll know that doesn't look right. But if you have examined the parish registers from Croft and Daresbury, and you've seen his father's signature over and over and over again, you'll know it looks exactly right. So clearly this was a Bible that belonged to his father. With that knowledge, and in the photograph that they sent me, all I could read was the thing that said C. Dodgson, and then over here, a little pencil inscription that said C.L. Dodgson's copy. The spine was completely detached, but present. And so I was able to negotiate the purchase of this book. And then when it arrived, I realized that underneath where it says C.L. Dodgson's copy, there was this very faint, almost completely faded away inscription. And it said, "Given to," and then I couldn't see who it was given to because it's written on top in pencil, "In memoriam, June 21st, 1868. Well, June 21st, 1868 was the day that Lewis Carroll's father, Archdeacon Charles Dodgson, passed away. So obviously this was given by a member of his family sometime after his death. Probably not on that very day, because as Alan reminded me, he passed away late in the day, but sometime between the time that he died and probably the time that the family left Croft around the beginning of September. But how I was going to find out who it was inscribed to? So I took the book to my local book restorer because I wanted to get the spine reattached and have it look really nice, and he did a great job on that. but he also used some of his fancy technology to take a scan of that inscription. And it may be hard for you to read on the screen, but I was able to read that it said given to Mr. Foster. Well, you'd be right to ask who is Mr. Foster, but the good news is if you happen to just have written a book called Lewis Carroll Formed by Faith, you will immediately recognize that Mr. Foster was one of the two curates who was working for the family, working for Dodgson, essentially running the church because he had all these diocesan duties. The other curate was at that time was his son, Skeffington. And it was Mr. Foster who did the funeral for Archdeacon Dodgson. So my guess is that this book was presented by the family to him at the time on the day of the funeral. That would be the most likely thing. But here we have a book where someone who had no context believed that it belonged to Lewis Carroll. Once we get the context, we can see that it actually belonged to his father. And when we have a fuller picture, both a literal fuller picture with this ultraviolet scan and the knowledge of who these people were, we can create almost an entire provenance for this book. And it shows up in auction records at various times. I was able to suss out most of the provenance of it. And then the great thing is they found the one guy in the whole world who would rather have a book that belonged to Lewis Carroll's father than one that actually belonged to Lewis Carroll. Because there's a lot of books out there that belong to Lewis Carroll. I see multiple people in this room who have multiple books that belong to Lewis Carroll, but this is the only one I've ever seen that had his father's ownership signature in it. So I thought it was pretty cool. The other thing I found very interesting about this book, it is published by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was a fairly evangelical group. And Lewis Carroll's father was not evangelical. He was very high church. But he did preach a sermon for them at one point where it was like a fundraising sermon to raise money for this organization. And so my theory is that this book was given to him on the occasion of him preaching that sermon as a sort of thank you, because this is our new Bible that we just published or whatever. Anyhow, I just found that all very fascinating to go through. Is that the last picture I have? I think that's the last picture I have. So I'm very happy to, at the break, because I know that we have people listening online, so we won't do this in person right at this moment. At the break, we will play show and tell, and you can get your hands on some of these books and look at them up close. But right now, I think we have some time for questions. Is that right? Yeah, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I'm very happy to entertain questions, either about Formed by Faith or just about the research and scholarship process in general.
Charlie, a great talk again. Did Dodson's library have copies of Newman's sermons when he was an Anglican, as well as Newman's sermons after he became a Catholic and a cardinal?
I think the answer is yes. I would have to check the dates. I know he had a 6-volume set of Newman's parochial sermons, and I believe those were from his Anglican period. For those who don't know, John Henry Newman was one of the 3 leaders of the Oxford movement, which was a high church movement that grew out of a sermon that Newman preached in the early 1830s. And he was at the time the rector of St. Mary's, the University Church of Oxford. And he would have known Lewis Carroll's father. The other 2 leaders of that movement were E.B. Pusey, who was a very close friend of Lewis Carroll's father, and Keble, who probably knew him because he was an examiner at the time that Lewis Carroll's father would have been taking examinations. So he certainly encountered the high church movement as an undergraduate at Oxford. I think the answer is yes. One of the tricky things about evaluating the religious books in Lewis Carroll's library is there's nothing in the documentation we have about his father's estate that says where his father's books went to. And it seems reasonable to assume that at least some of his father's books went to Skeffington, Edwin, and Charles, the 3 of his sons who were ordained. And maybe most of them went to Lewis Carroll, who was the academic of those 3. The other 2 were parochial priests. But we just don't know. So when we see a particular religious book in Lewis Carroll's diary, in Lewis Carroll's library, we can't be absolutely certain that that's a book that he went out and bought. It could just as easily be something that he inherited in a block of stuff from his father. Yeah, except for obviously for ones that came after 1868. And there's some very interesting ones that come after 1868. Yeah.
Okay, we have a
Over here.
whole bunch of questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first one from Dieter DeLonga. He says, this is more a remark than a question. Given Carroll's love for the number 42 and children, I wonder what he made of 2 Kings 2:23-24, which describes 42 children being torn apart by 2 bears because they mocked the prophet Elijah.
Okay. I'm not sure I completely understand the comment, but thank you.
Okay. All right, I'll just leave that.
Yeah.
Molly Martin says, does your book delve into CLD's personal thoughts on the Darwin debate? Since he invented a game with the children, finding examples of natural selection, wondered what further information is available.
So I get this question every time I talk about this book, about Lewis Carroll and Darwin. And the simple fact of the matter is that, as previously stated, I very much wanted to work from actual evidence. And there's just not very much evidence about Lewis Carroll's opinions about Darwin. We know what books he had in his library. We know that he did write a letter to Darwin about, here's a photograph you could use in your book about the expressions of emotions in animals. We know that he attended the great debate between Thomas Huxley and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce on the subject of evolution, in which Wilberforce famously asked Huxley, is it on your mother's side or your father's that you're descended from a monkey? And a lot of people now feel like that's kind of the point at which Wilberforce lost the debate because he was sort of belittling the opposition. But Dodson never really wrote down his own opinions. We can make guesses. We can see that he had books in his library that worked to reconcile science and religion. He had books in his library that worked to reconcile science and the supernatural. So I think he was very much interested in a unified field theory of science, religion, supernatural, et cetera, et cetera. But he didn't write much down about his particular thoughts on the subject. So a lot of what we have to do is just conjecture. But one of the things I do talk about in the book is I look at some of the school books that he used when he was a child, and also at some of the books that he had to read for ordination. And it's important to remember, it's in this Bible actually has the same thing, but Lewis Carroll's schoolmaster, James Tate II, his schoolmaster at Richmond in the in the 1840s, wrote a book called First Classical Maps. And in the back of it, there's something called Sacred Chronology, and it gives you the date for when everything happened. And it gives the exact date of creation. I think it's something like 4004 BC. This is when the world was created. And it's important for us to understand that that's the childhood that Lewis Carroll came out of, where that date was as factual as that 2 + 2 = 4. And by the time he is, a grown man or getting older in the 1890s, he's living in a completely different world. So we don't know a lot about his thoughts about that, but we can guess from his library that he was interested in reconciling those things. And I don't think that progress in science was ever a threat to his faith. I think it's fair to say that.
This next question is from Maxine Donnelly, who spoke this morning. She says, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I'm so excited to read your book and listen to your podcast. As someone interested in the latter medium, it's great to see a scholar using it alongside more traditional output. A comment and a question. In my research on MacDonald, I found myself wading into his theology and identifying with it, even though my faith is different from his. Do you think studying Carroll and his text gave you a new perspective on your scholarship and how it intersects with your own faith? Must we have sympathy, willingness to connect with Christianity in order to study Victorian texts, given Christianity's influence during the period?
So, as I said, I think you have to have sympathy. I think you can't be the sort of person who belittles the idea of Christian belief or of any religious belief. I don't think that means you have to subscribe to everything that he subscribed to. But I will say, especially reading the sermons of his father often would make me not necessarily question my, but it would sort of help me develop like things that I'd not really thought about. Sort of issues about the Eucharist, for instance, that his father writes about. His father wrote a sermon called "What Do the Wicked Eat and Drink in the Lord's Supper?" Because there's this idea that if you are unrepentant, then you don't receive the body of Christ. So what do you receive? Is it just a piece of bread? Should you not be allowed to go up there? How does this work? How do we know? We can't card you to see if you're unrepentant, right? And Lewis Carroll's father said, Well, his way to solve this problem was to say that the Eucharist was a two-part act, and it's not completed until that bread doesn't become the body of Christ until both the consecration by the priest and the reception by the repentant sinner. So that if you're not a repentant sinner, then the process is not complete. And I thought that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And there have been times since then when I've been at the communion rail and that idea has occurred to me. So yes, I think, the research has not necessarily changed my own faith or my own beliefs, but has, given me things to think about in my own personal life.
Just a quick question on that particular issue.
Yeah.
Is that when the Anglican Church was sort of transforming the mind? You can't hear me?
The people online want to be able to hear you. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure it's worth hearing, but just a interesting insight into your that issue, which is fascinating, by the way, is what point was the Anglican Church readopting the strict Catholic interpretation of that transformation of the body and the blood? Because it wasn't in that general time period, or am I way off?
So, I mean, there was a huge debate about this at the time that Lewis Carroll's father was a part of. And it's really part of this much broader divide in the church between the evangelical wing of the church, which was coming to its own in the 19th century, and this high church movement that Lewis Carroll's father was a part of, which in its purest sense, you can come back with me to Winston-Salem, and next Sunday we'll go to, I belong to an Anglo-Catholic parish. So we're at the far end of that spectrum when it comes to worship. And so that divide still exists. But Lewis Carroll's father got into some pretty heated debates in print over these very issues, especially about baptism and baptismal regeneration. And there was, you're living in a time period when a lot of high churchmen are going back over to the Roman Catholic Church. And there's a lot of debate about what exactly did the English Reformation mean? Because the English Reformation is very different from the Continental Reformation. It was not a rebellion against Roman Catholicism. It was a rebellion against a particular pope's authority and against what they saw as sort of imperfections that had come into Roman Catholicism. So all of these issues kind of work together. And I try to explain these things in the book in a way that is neither obfuscating nor condescending, because I don't want to assume either that you know nothing or that you know everything. I want everybody to be able to read the book. And one way I get around that issue is what we call discursive footnotes, except they're endnotes. I have to complain to academia right now about notes moving from the bottom of the page to the back of the book. I'm fine when it's a citation, but sometimes I'll say something about some of these issues, and I'll have a discursive footnote because somebody may not know what I mean by baptismal regeneration or by transubstantiation or something like that. And so you'll put in a discursive footnote, and then you, poor reader, have to flip all the way to the back of the book to see whether it's anything that interests you or not. So just keep a bookmark there in the notes pages, and if there's something you don't understand, hopefully I explained it for you. So.
Or could I add one much simpler question than that one, because is deep in the weeds? Is Darwin resisted publication of Survival of the Fittest because his wife's religious beliefs. Was there ever any pushback from the Anglican Church against Dodson and his writings?
Against Dodson?
Yeah.
No, I mean, Dodson did have some stances that were contrary to Anglican dogma at the time, especially his stance on eternal punishment, but he never published it broadly enough for,
I said Dodson, I should have said Lewis Carroll, maybe. I mean,
yeah, well, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
So there's no ever any pushback or
no, I mean, his faith life was mostly private and between him and but he did preach a sermon about eternal punishment late in his life in which he took issue with that doctrine. But it was never published. It was his intention to publish it, but it was never published. And so it wasn't widely enough known, I think, for there to have been pushback.
So he never got a negative interpretation of his writings from the Anglican side.
No, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Thank you. Enjoyed your talk.
As always, a very fine talk, Charlie. And I have a public service kind of question. Here we have a biographer of Lewis Carroll in our midst. And the two questions I said, or the question that every biographer gets asked or needs to address in some way, shape, or form is about the two or one mystery in Carroll's life. The separation of Carroll and young Alice, what happened, and or, which could be the same thing, the Collingwood notion, there's a shadow in Carroll's life of the sadness. Any thoughts? What are your thoughts on
So,
those
I mean,
mysteries?
in the first one, I didn't think I had any new evidence or anything new to contribute to that.
I didn't think so. Otherwise, that you
But,
would have started your talk with
Yeah,
that.
but on the second factor, you know, I really toyed, I wanted with this book to try to keep speculation out of it and just to present the story and the evidence, and maybe future people will add speculation, but I do have some speculation on the issue of a shadow. But I think the real shadow in Lewis Carroll's life was the death of his father. I mean, he says himself that it was the greatest, you know, grief that ever befell him, and his mother's already died, you know, much more surprisingly, much younger, right when he's just gone away to college. I mean, 2 days after he arrives at Christ Church, his mother unexpectedly dies, and yet the death of his father, as a man in his late 60s, was the greatest shock of his life. We see after the death of his father, between 1861 when he is ordained and about 1867, he's preaching, he's assisting with baptisms, he's living the life of somebody who might become a priest one day. And that slowly starts to begin to taper off. After the death of his father, none of that for 20 years. The only time he helps out with services is for his brother's wedding and his aunt's funeral, and a couple of times when he's kind of forced into it. So I didn't want to go as far as saying that he had a crisis of faith at that point. I think he was still a man of faith, but I think the death of his father affected him in a lot of ways that maybe we haven't fully explored. I think one way is that it was, maybe for him a positive way perhaps, was that it lifted this weight of expectation of you should become a parochial priest and you should follow in my footsteps and do that, which is not really a path that Lewis Carroll wanted to take. But I think it's fascinating to me that in those early sermons, those early years of helping out at churches around Oxford, he is choosing these very, very high church parishes, in some cases even higher church than his father was. And then after his father dies and there's 20-year hiatus and he begins to preach again, he's preaching at these, you know, at this Christ Church servants service. And he's preaching at the mission room here and at the high school. He's going in a much more broad church direction. And so I think to me, in the context of this book, that was the more interesting shadow than any possible shadow of romance or anything like that. But again, I tried to stick with things where I actually had some evidence, rather than, I think, I don't want to criticize other biographers, but I do think there has been studies where the emphasis has been on speculation rather than on looking at what the evidence actually shows.
Okay, the next question comes from the chat. The LCSNA website states, in his later years, Carroll also joined the Society for Psychical Research, founded 1882, as a scientific exploration of a possible alternative expression of spirituality. Does your research support that statement? Is it that he was doing, what he was doing in that seemingly unlikely group?
So he certainly owned a lot of books about various aspects of spiritualism, of the supernatural. He owned a lot of books about different religions other than Christianity, about different sects of Christianity. He was not, as is often stated, a founding member of the Society for Psychical Research. He was, in their newsletter when he died, they said he was among the earliest members, but not a founding member. So I think part of it was, I think that was all part of, he wasn't trying to find something to replace Christianity, but there was very much in the news in those days, you know, that another one, again, this is all about context. There were these mediums who were having seances, who were making all sorts of claims. You know, there were ghost stories that were published. And so he was, I think, fascinated in finding out truth about these things. And so I don't think he went into that either as fully saying we need to debunk all this, or fully saying there is this whole spiritual world that we don't know about. He was just fascinated by it. And he does say, I can't remember exactly the context or the quote, but there's some place where he says, essentially there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophy. He kind of comes with that idea. I can't remember the exact quote that's on the website, so I don't want to say that it's absolutely right or absolutely wrong, but the fact that he joined that society is true, and the fact that he owned a lot of books that explore those kind of issues is true.
Thank you for the presentation. It's wonderful, and I can't wait to read your book. This actually goes back to the question about his standing with the rest of the members of the church, and specifically, what is, I understand that if he had taken certain orders, he wouldn't have been able to go to the theater. Is that correct? And could you expound on
Sure.
that?
So Collingwood, his nephew and biographer, says that so his bishop was Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, and when you're ordained in the Anglican Church, you kind of have to do what your bishop tells you to do. So he's ordained as a deacon, but he's never ordained as a priest. And why he delayed being ordained as a deacon for many years, and why he was never ordained as a priest, probably occupies about 40 or 50 pages of this book. So I don't want to go into all the details. But Collingwood says that Wilberforce had said, you can't be a priest in my diocese and go to the theater. I have looked through everything printed I can find that Wilberforce ever wrote, and I haven't found that printed anywhere. Whether he said it verbally, it's impossible for me to know. I've found no other evidence of that explicit statement except Collingwood. However, Wilberforce certainly did say that as a priest, you have to kind of pull back from worldly pleasures somewhat. There's a real irony here, because people later in Dodgson's life would sometimes describe him as puritanical. And yet I think one of the reasons he didn't go into the priesthood was because he didn't want to be that puritanical. So it's all sort of your perspective. But Wilberforce certainly introduced this idea that a priest should not indulge in worldly pleasures to the extent that other people should. That may have been a contributing factor to Dodgson not wanting to go into the priesthood. I don't think it was the primary factor. I think there were others that were more. I mean, he says himself, for many reasons, I decided not to do this. And I try to explore many of those many reasons. But I looked and looked and looked to try to find a place where Wilberforce said, you can't go to the theater, and I just couldn't find it. He just never quite gets there. Yeah.
Charlie, you alluded to this a little bit, but are there any examples that you found, things that you either discovered or in your ultimate findings, that caused you to reevaluate any of Carroll's fictional texts, the Alice?
Well,
Sylvia Brunel,
I
et cetera?
certainly looked at all his fictional texts. I mean, I think if you want to know a lot about how Lewis Carroll felt on social issues and on issues like temptation and sin and something, it's all in Sylvia and Bruno books. I mean, there's all these places where he just goes into these little discursive sermonettes almost. And some of them are hilarious, like the one on drinking, and some of them are very, very serious, like the ones on sin and temptation. But I also went back and looked at, I mean, although what I said earlier about, if it wasn't new, I wasn't going to include it. I did go back and look at the Alice texts, and there's a big difference between Underground, Wonderland, and Looking Glass. There's this progression. Underground is a book which we are told was largely the result of a spontaneous storytelling. Then Wonderland, there's a little more thought and structure to it, and then Looking Glass, even is done over a period of several years, and so my thought is, I think if things in your subconscious and unconscious are going to sink into your storytelling, they are most likely to do that when you're doing spontaneous storytelling, not when you're sitting down intentionally going, there will be no morals, there will be no. And if you look at Alice in that light, you can certainly see the influence of two great storytelling traditions in Lewis Carroll's childhood and his past. One is the children's books that he read that he in many ways is rebelling against in Alice, books like the Fairchild Family. But the other is, of course, the great story of Christianity and Scripture and Anglicanism, which he heard every single day. And so you can, I would never say that this was done intentionally, but you can certainly look at Alice as a book that begins with a fall and ends with a resurrection, a book that includes a baptism and a communion. I mean, you've got these things that say, eat me and drink me in them. You know, you've got a thing where you can't be a part of this community until you go into this water. And there's lots of other things. I don't think that to me was a reconception of Alice. It's not, I would never make the argument that he did that intentionally, but I think it's worth considering that when you tell a spontaneous story, the deepest part of your being comes out in that spontaneous storytelling. Yeah.
I know we've got more questions, but we're almost out of time. So actually we are just about out of time. We're going to take one last question, and then hopefully Charlie can answer some questions during the break if
Sure.
you're here, or maybe you can catch him through his website or something later if you have questions.
Or you could just buy the book. That would help too. Yeah.
Charlie, I was particularly interested in your delineation of some of the latter year sermons that he delivered. Is there a sense that he was a celebrity priest in that way?
So, I mean, you know, he in Oxford. So let's first of all admit that the idea that Lewis Carroll's identity as Charles Dodgson was a secret. It was like the least well-kept secret in the history of all secrets. Even he didn't do a very good job of keeping that secret. He mostly didn't want it to be in the press, but it was in the press all the time. So, I mean, I've traced it in the press back into the 1860s, I think. But certainly, I think the one time he might have been considered a celebrity preacher is he gave 2 sermons at Oxford at the University Church of St. Mary's, which you saw a picture of earlier, that were for special services for Oxford undergraduates. And those were both in 1897, in the last year of his life, preached on 2 topics very close to his heart: reverence and eternal punishment. These were not sermons for working people that were, you know, sort of done in simple terms of storytelling. These are much more academic sermons because it was for an academic class. And it's clear from the remembrances of people who went there. I mean, people wrote down, hey, went and saw Lewis Carroll preach today, and here's what it was like, you know. So in that sense, I'd say, you know, maybe a local celebrity preacher, a lot of those people would have gone to that service anyhow, but I'm sure there was like, hey, you know, this guy, he wrote Alice in Wonderland, you know. I'm sure that was going on at the time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Charlie.
Thanks.